In this video, I'm going to digress, and when was I ever known to do that, and share some thoughts with you about fugue, since for the last couple of months I've been dealing almost exclusively with the fugues from J.S. Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier and have never actually put into words some things that I think might be useful for my viewers to know. I was really struck by the need to do this as I began the F-sharp major fugue of Book 2, my next analytical project for this channel, which should be finished and posted in a few days. I know that some of you are old hands at this. This is mostly for the benefit of those who have never had a class in formal analysis, and what I'm presenting here is information that I hope will make your listening experience more comprehensive and enjoyable. You may have heard me say from time to time that fugue is not a musical form, but a musical procedure. The reason I say that is that a musical form can reliably give you a good idea of the shape of the entire composition if you're informed of its form in advance. If you know what sonata form is, then you're prepared to hear music in that form and be able to keep your place in it, as well as enjoy the occasional surprises that are yours to relish when a composer deviates from established norms. If I tell you in advance that a piece is constructed in variation form, you already know what its basic shape is before you hear a note of it. But that's not at all true in the case of fugue, as must be apparent from the examples you've already heard in the Well-Tempered Clavier. Let's start with what makes a fugue a fugue. As far as I've been able to determine, the only requirements that are set in stone are there must be an exposition of a subject, and that exposition must be followed by some development. Beyond that, or rather enlarging upon that, the possibilities are endless, especially as regards the development. I'll see if I can build up a clear picture of the possibilities piece by piece, starting with the subject. The subject of a fugue is a distinctive melody that's sounded by more than one voice sequentially at contrasting harmonic levels of the fugue's primary key. That's why in my analyses you've seen me identify the subject as occurring in a designated voice at the tonic, and the first answer occurring at a different voice and at a different harmonic level, usually dominant. So it goes until all the voices have had their say. In most cases, the subject is harmonically open-ended, or nearly so, and the answers ideally overlap a bit so that the outpouring is continuous. You'll see quite a few cases, however, where an overlap of the subject in its second answer especially is impossible because of some harmonic considerations that have to be satisfied. And in those cases, you'll see a little connective tissue slipping in to reestablish the music's tonic so that the second answer can proceed. In general, a three-voice fugue will begin with an exposition that includes a statement at the tonic level, followed by two answers, one at the dominant and the other at the tonic. For fugues that include more than three voices, the exposition is correspondingly enlarged, and once the final statement of the subject is complete, the development begins. One of the things you'll want to notice at the beginning of each of the fugues that I present in this series is that Bach indicates how many voices are participating. That will let you know something important about the exposition at least. I think I need to talk a little about what exposition means in music. Most viewers will probably be familiar with the use of that term in examining the structure of a novel. In that case, the exposition is that portion of the novel that sets up the story, including the introduction of principal characters and the establishing of a setting. Once that's done, the really interesting part of the novel can begin, its working out, its development. In any music to which those terms are applicable, it's usually the development sections that I find most interesting, with the parallel to literature being obvious. But of course, first you have to have material to develop, and that's what the exposition is for. If you were to see me use the term exposition without having established any context, which is, of course, nonsensical, but humor me for the sake of my point, the chances would be overwhelming that I'm talking about the opening large section of a sonata-form movement with its contrasting themes set in contrasting keys, closing in a different but related key from the one that opened the movement. In a fugue, however, I'm describing a very different structure, which I generally identify as a fugal exposition to distinguish it from anything remotely like an exposition in sonata form. I believe that takes care of the first requirement of a fugue, so let's move on to the development, which is essentially everything that happens after the exposition. There are so many ways to handle this that there are very few general principles to work from. There are, however, a few regularly recurring features of fugues written from the 17th through 20th centuries, so we can talk about those. The first to address is the question of what can be done with, or perhaps to, the subject, other than bringing it back from time to time to unify the piece. There's a range of possibilities known generally as permutations. One of the most common is inversion, presenting the melody upside down so that what earlier went up now goes down by the same distance and vice versa. Bach uses this variation technique quite a lot, and after looking at enough of his fugue subjects, it starts to dawn on one which of those would be good candidates for inversion. Another common developmental technique is bringing back the subject in either augmented or diminished rhythmic values, such that a restatement of the subject, usually not in isolation, will occupy only half the time it originally did, or twice as long. There are times when you'll see Bach using both of these techniques at once, together with a statement of the subject in its original form, its prime form, in some other voice. It's passages like that that leave me shaking my head in disbelief and wonderment. The most common developmental technique is the chopping of the subject into its constituent motives and then subjecting those motives to overlapped sequence, often while modulating to a brighter or darker key. And there are fugues, although fairly rare in Bach, when the episodes between reappearances of the subject are not particularly developmental, but consist instead of what seems to be new material. Those fugues naturally take on a rondo-like flavor, with the subject serving as refrain. Incidentally, that description I just gave you could, with equal force, be applied to any number of typical concerto movements by Bach, with the ritornello, the recurring material, taking the form of a fugal exposition of generous proportions played by the entire ensemble, and the several reappearances of the ritornello set apart by modulating solo episodes, often of a related but clearly contrasting character. In most fugues, there are several recurrences of the subject during the developmental unfolding, and in isolation, these are usually known as middle entries. Sometimes the middle entries include an answer, and there are times when they are grown into full-fledged expositions in addition to the original one. Those subsequent expositions often include modulation, which the initial one typically doesn't, and are thus sometimes identified as counter-expositions. At times, the returns are handled in such a way that a statement of the subject is answered in a more rapid-fire way than during the exposition, the answers piling on to each other. This is known as a stretto, after the Italian word for stress. The term is a usefully descriptive one in a variety of compositional settings, not just in fugues. For instance, if you encounter a passage in a Beethoven composition in sonata form that includes a fairly leisurely harmonic progression and then repeats that same progression at twice its original tempo, that could be considered a formal stretto. In fugue, however, stretto is usually reserved for those passages that I described. One regular feature of Bach's fugues is the generating of what's called a counter-subject. At times, I call attention to this feature, but sometimes not, depending on how much there is to call attention to overall, and wishing always for my analyses to be at least potentially penetrable. Here's the way that works. The opening voice in a fugue sets forth the subject, and at some point before that subject is brought to its close, a second voice enters with the first answer at a different harmonic level. While that answer is being given, the first voice continues, but no longer with the subject. Instead, it's now charged with the generating of interesting counterpoint to the subject. There are times when that contrapuntal fleshing out is treated quite freely, but in some instances, the counterpoint itself is so distinctive and returns so often in the company of the subject that it's considered something more, something usually identified as a countersubject. This feature makes possible music of almost incredible complexity, interest, and beauty. I believe that covers the basics of fugue writing. There are other features that occur regularly in Bach, but these are apt to apply to his compositions more generally. For instance, his awareness of that point in a composition that lies at the golden section temporal division, about 62% of the way through the movement. Whether or not that proportion can really be intuited by even expert listeners seems doubtful to me, but it seems to have been important to Bach as an organizing principle, and so very often we'll find something significant happening right at that moment. In those cases, I tend to draw attention to it. Now let's consider a few illustrative examples, all of them brief enough to make it fairly easy to hold them in mind. The first is from Book 1, the Fugue in D minor. Here you'll see a number of the features that I've talked about, including the presentation of the subject in inversion during the returns. There is a clearly defined counter-subject, and something significant happens right at the golden section temporal division. I probably need to say that in three-voice fugues, it's sometimes unclear how the voices should be identified. Clearly, treble and bass are candidates for identifying the highest and lowest voices, but that leaves one with the clumsy nomenclature middle voice to be used every time it contributes a statement of the subject. I much prefer to use the more poetic sounding soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, but sometimes there's some ambiguity there, and in those cases you're apt to see me identify the statements as belonging to one of those voices based on its range. I mention this only to address and attempt to shed light on any easy to understand confusion in advance. My second example is drawn from Book 2, another minor key fugue, this one in C minor. Here you'll see Bach use two different permutations of the subject in a stretto context that also includes the subject in its prime form. Let me mention in passing a fairly common harmonic feint in Bach, a chord of peculiar weight, intensity, and force used to set up the final cadence. It's a predominant functioning chord, usually known as the common tone diminished seventh, a diminished seventh chord that includes the tonic pitch as one of its members. It's a flexible harmony, often used in a purely decorative way, as at the beginning of Franz Schubert's magnificent C major string quintet. More often, however, it acts as a secondary dominant, setting the stage for and resolving easily onto either the tonic 6/4 chord or the dominant. In all cases, I identify it in my harmonic analysis the same way, as a sharp 2 diminished seventh chord. I offer this explanation for the benefit of anyone who has spotted it and might have wondered about it. What you're about to hear is truly a compositional tour de force. One more, this one a bright, cheerful, rather comical fugue in one of the most unlikely keys you'll ever encounter. This is also from Book 2, the fugue in C sharp major. You'll see some features that you've seen in the other two, only with application here to something wry and witty, with an inversion included in the opening fugal exposition and with an ending that's nothing short of hilarious. I hope that helped. Good listening to you. I'm moved to include a little bonus. If you'd like a foretaste of the F-sharp major fugue that I'll be posting in a few days, here's my first pass through it. My guess is that any of you could probably complete my analysis of this one without undue difficulty. Bach is at times more transparent than others. The pianist, as always, is Tatiana Nikolayeva.